A century of shadows and exile. After that night of carnage near Notre-Dame, Isabeau and I fled. It was no victory, merely a reversal of roles. We, the hunters, had become the prey. Paris spat us out from its depths, while behind us, flames licked the cobblestones. And so, we slipped through the ages. Florence under the Medici, London drowned in fog and alchemy, Madrid trembling beneath the Inquisition. We watched empires crumble and gods turn to dust. But the hunters, they never died. Their hatred passed down like a cursed inheritance. Paris, 1572. A city on the razor's edge, ready to slit its own throat at the slightest provocation. Behind the gilded walls of the palaces, hearts were black. The air reeked of soot, sweat, and the acrid wine of taverns. Here, every glance lasted too long. Every silence carried the weight of a threat. The Black Death was only a memory now, replaced by a more insidious plague, intolerance. Art flourished beneath the brushes of Titian and Leonardo. Science defied dogma. Montaigne whispered to those willing to listen. But the night remained unchanged. It stretched, patient, and I was its child. Isabeau had become a widow, wealthy, untouchable, a patron of poets and scholars. I haunted the alleyways, a specter among the living. History repeated itself, relentless. I was there, an immortal witness to a world in ashes. Tensions thickened, creeping. Secret masses were held behind closed doors. Venomous pamphlets passed from hand to hand. Whispered names already carried the scent of blood. Paris quivered, a glowing ember on the verge of eruption. The nights stretched in suffocating anticipation, but another urgency, more primal, more inescapable, demanded its due. Hunger. It wasn't unbearable yet, but it soon would be. Better to satisfy it now, quickly, without thinking, like crushing an insect beneath one's boot. The stench hit me first. A foul mix of rancid sweat, cheap alcohol, and festering infection. A filth so deep not even the rain had washed it away. I slowed, not out of hesitation, but out of disgust, tasting my own revulsion. There, under the awning of an abandoned shop, lay the dregs of humanity. A slumped, flaccid mass, clinging to life through sheer inertia. I could have ignored him. He was nothing, just a ruined body, a life already withered. Usually I chose better. Vibrant souls, rich blood, existences full of potential that I plucked from the world like a cruel child picking a perfect flower. But tonight was different. A whim, a morbid curiosity. I crouched beside him. His breath, rasping, whistled between cracked yellow teeth. His grimy fingers with blackened, broken nails clung to a coat so tattered it seemed fused to his flesh. Beneath his eyes, his skin was marbled with purple, a crusted wound splitting his temple. He would barely feel a thing, I thought. His body was already a ruin, his nerves dulled by cold and misery. A tasteless prey without struggle, a life I could snuff out without facing anything more than a rancid sigh. He twitched. A flicker of instinct, a remnant of humanity refusing to die. A smirk slipped from my lips. It wasn't hunger that guided my hand to his throat, nor necessity, just the urge to extinguish something useless, to finish what was already hanging by a thread. A punishment for the audacity of existing like this. Pathetic, offensive. I pressed. Softly at first, then harder. His eyelids flew open, horror flickering in them like a futile prayer. His fingers clawed at my wrist, pathetic, desperate. His heart stumbled for a fraction of a second before my fangs pierced his flesh. The blood, warm and tainted, spilled onto my tongue like soured wine. Bitter, polluted, perfect. It was during this time that I met Raphael. A Huguenot astrologer in his 50s, his face gaunt from long vigils beneath the celestial vault. His salt and pepper beard, neatly trimmed, framed a thin mouth whose corners were often tensed in concentration. His pale, almost translucent blue eyes reflected the distant gleams of the stars he tracked each night. Beneath his broad forehead, furrowed with wrinkles, testaments to years of study and contemplation, his keen gaze seemed able to read between the lines of the world. Draped in a dark cloak with worn edges, he knew that the future was written in the heavens, but he had yet to realize that horror could wear a human guise. Our first encounter took place in the library of the Collège de Sorbonne, a sanctuary where knowledge slumbered beneath the weight of centuries. The air was thick with melted wax and aged leather, the silence broken only by the rustling of pages and the scratching of quills on parchment. I haunted these halls, not out of thirst for knowledge, but to brush against the shadow of what I once was. Before the night became my kingdom, I had shaped light upon parchment. I loved the liquid gold flowing over the illuminated letters, the meticulous dance of the brush, tracing arabesques and interlacing lines. But that time was gone. And it was there that I saw him. Seated alone at a distant table, far from the theologians and learned scholars, he was absorbed in the reading of a yellowed manuscript. Before him, a parchment covered in circles and sigils drawn in dark ink. He was not like the others. Where scholars dissected knowledge with greed, he seemed to question the universe itself, seeking to uncover truths beyond human concern. It was that thirst for understanding that made me stay. One night, without premeditation, I sat across from him. He did not flinch. He merely observed me, curiosity glinting in his irises. "You study me like an alchemist observes his Athenor," I murmured. He smiled faintly, tracing invisible constellations on the wooden table.
"You speak of time as a river, but I see it differently."
"And how is that?"
"As a circle. Everything begins again. Everything repeats, inevitably."
His gaze locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of his thoughts, that strange sensation that he perceived in me what others could not.
"And you? Where do you stand in this cycle? You are not like the others."
I remained silent. He sensed the anomaly within me, though he could not name it. But he did not flee. He did not pray. He did not tremble. He questioned, analyzed, dissected the unknown with the patience of an alchemist. Others would have recoiled from the darkness that cloaked me. Others would have prayed to their God, murmuring psalms with trembling lips. Not him. He spoke to me. He dug. He forced my answers without me understanding how or why. Night after night, I listened as he unraveled the celestial mechanisms before me, seeking in the stars truths I knew were unattainable. Raphael was not prey, he was a mirror. And that is why I could not break him. The days unraveled in an oppressive weight. Something was changing. A creeping tension seeped into the streets of Paris, lurking beneath whispered conversations, concealed in the flickering shadows of candlelight. Clandestine masses grew scarcer. The taverns buzzed with feverish rumors. In the palaces, the nobles whispered in hushed voices, their faces more solemn, their gazes evasive. Servants crossed themselves nervously before delivering their missives, a latent fear, a diffuse unease, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Isabeau, with her spider's patience, wove her web within these circles, where information dripped like poison. One night, she returned from a supper hosted by one of the king's advisors, a glacial glint in her eyes. Without a word, she dropped a stolen parchment onto the table. I unfolded it slowly. The ink had bled under a trembling hand. Between the cryptic lines of a feigned blessing, a warning emerged. The unity of the kingdom shall be ensured. Those who defile the land of France will not see the next month. I let the paper fall back down. Veiled threats like so many others, I murmured.
"No,
Isabeau replied.
this is not a warning. It is an announcement."
She did not shiver. Her gaze did not waver. The cold in my veins found no echo in hers. To her, this was merely a repetition of an old tragedy, a cycle endlessly repeating itself. The massacre to come was just another night stained red in a life too long to still be moved by such things. I went to see Raphael. The astrologer welcomed me with his usual curiosity, but a flicker of concern passed through his eyes when he saw my grim expression. I laid out my fears to him, the murmurs, the letter. He sighed, crossing his arms.
The tensions are high, that much is true. But do you really believe that the king, that Catherine de Medici herself would order a massacre? Paris is not a city of butchers.
Paris has never needed a king to drown itself in blood, I replied. A sad smile touched his lips.
We have survived wars. We have endured Saint-Jacques and the Michelade. These are but rumors.
His fingers brushed the parchment, as if he could divine the unspoken truths within it.
You see things differently,
he murmured.
I knew it from the first time we met. There is something in you that escapes time.
I looked away. These are just intuitions. He slowly shook his head.
No, I have observed you. You never truly breathe deeply. Your eyes, they catch the light in a strange way.
A heavy silence settled between us, heavier even than the bells, ready to toll the death knell. I did not have the heart to convince him further. 3 nights later, an anonymous pamphlet circulated through the Huguenot districts. It called for vigilance, spoke of blades drawn in the shadows, and of imminent peril. The gates of the Louvre were closing earlier. Armed men gathered near the palace. The air had thickened, laden with a dull foreboding. A distant rumble before the storm. And then everything fell apart. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang. A scream tore through the silence. Then another. A howling wave swept through the streets, carried by the clash of steel and the cries of agony. Doors were shattered by axe blows, latches ripped away by brutal hands. Torches flared in the night, casting the distorted shadows of executioners onto the walls. In a house torn apart, a family had taken refuge in the last intact room. The father, a simple craftsman, stood before them, brandishing a fire poker, a pitiful last stand against the bloodthirsty tide crashing down upon them. The soldiers struck without hesitation. The first blow struck his shoulder, breaking his stance. The second plunged into his side. He collapsed, his gaze locked onto his wife, who clutched their 2 terrified children.
Mercy,
She pleaded, her voice shattered by fear. But mercy had no place in this night of slaughter. Steel sliced through the air and fell. A cry. Then silence. The children, too young to understand, still clung to their mother's lifeless body when the executioners raised their blades once more. The steel gleamed under the firelight before plunging down. The small bodies crumpled, their sacred innocence spilled onto the ground. Blood ran in crimson rivulets, mingling with soot and ash. A pregnant woman was hurled against a wall, her belly slashed open with a dagger. Her scream was lost in the chaos as she collapsed, trembling hands futilely trying to hold in the life spilling from her. Further away, a man was impaled on a roasting spit, his body still twitching in its final convulsions. His executioners laughed, turning the spit as if he were nothing more than a beast at a fair. Blades fell with savage precision, rending flesh and bone, splattering dark streaks onto the facades. Moans rose from doorsteps where gutted bodies slumped, steaming entrails spilling onto the cobblestones. Children dragged an infant at the end of a rope, their faces marbled with terror and tears, while a half-naked woman was hung from a beam, her hair whipping against her face, frozen in agony. I was on the rooftops when the pleas reached me, drowned beneath the screams and the pounding of boots. Cries for help, broken, useless. The air was thick with acrid smoke, a blend of burning wood and charred flesh. In the ravaged alleys, corpses piled up, some still convulsing, others trampled beyond recognition, reduced to pulped remains. Severed heads rolled across the stones, their empty eyes frozen in ultimate horror. Isabeau stood beside me. There was something unfathomable in her, an absence of emotion that made her unreadable. As I gazed at a collapsed figure against a wall, she murmured in an even voice,
History repeats itself. Man is predictable.
The Seine, black under the night, was already carrying mutilated bodies, their faces locked in silent terror. Raphael was among them. I found him at the threshold of his home, slumped against a shattered door. A trail of blood stretched beneath him, seeping between the stones. He was still breathing, but barely. A deep wound cut across his forehead, crimson rivulets slowly trailing down his cheek. His body trembled in agony, fingers grasping weakly at the tattered remnants of his tunic.
"This is not my place,"
he whispered.
"Neither in the night, nor under the eyes of angels."
I wanted to offer him eternity, to give him what I had become, but he refused. His blood-stained hand rose feebly, trembling, marked with gashes and splinters.
"I always knew. You did not belong to this world. Not really.
A faint smile touched his lips.
I do not condemn you. Perhaps you are simply something else. A truth men cannot comprehend."
His hand fell. A final breath. A last flicker of consciousness. Then nothing, and all around me, the slaughter continued. Dawn had not yet touched the horizon, and Paris was already a charnel house. The stench of blood saturated the air, acrid, metallic, mingling with the scent of charred wood. I moved through the wreckage, my steps slipping between lifeless bodies. When Isabeau found me much later, I was wandering like a specter amid the remnants of the carnage. She laid a cold hand on my shoulder.
Come,
she murmured.
this is no longer our war.
I lifted my eyes to hers. Her silhouette blended into the ash-laden mist hovering over the city. Behind her, the last echoes of the massacre faded, replaced by the priests' litanies blessing the dead. "You are wrong," I whispered. "We are not strangers to this madness." She said nothing, but in her gaze, a fleeting glimmer appeared, a shadow of regret. Paris was burning. Flames devoured the rooftops, reflecting off blood-slicked cobblestones. The bells had long since fallen silent, replaced by screams, the clash of steel, the pounding of boots. The stench of burning flesh, soot, and iron saturated the air, a macabre symphony that would haunt this city forever. Isabeau and I moved through this nightmare, silent specters witnessing a carnage we had not wrought. Mankind did not need monsters to devour itself. A movement caught my eye. Under the arch of a ruined house, a small figure huddled in the shadows. A child, no more than 10 years old. His face was streaked with ash and tears, his oversized shirt soaked in blood, his own or someone else's. He was trembling, but it was not fear of the massacre. He was looking at us, our shadows stretched across the scorched wall, cast by the flickering firelight. Our movements, too fluid, too silent, were not human. And yet he did not scream. He did not look away. He simply reached out a hand toward me. "Help me." His voice was barely a whisper, drowned in the chorus of dying prayers and agonized cries filling the city. I should have looked away, as I had with Raphael. The image of his broken body surfaced in my mind, his fingers clenched around his tattered tunic, his last breath slipping into the night. "Don't become like them." Raphael's words echoed in my mind, a cold whisper in the chaos. Isabeau's hand, cold as death, touched my arm.
We can't.
She murmured. She was right. We couldn't save this child. Paris was a pit, a mass grave where innocence and cruelty tangled indistinguishably. But he was still here. His small fingers clung to my sleeve, leaving a smudge of soot on the dark fabric. He knew what we were. He had sensed it in our silence, in our unnatural stillness. Yet, he did not recoil. Again, he reached out. like Raphael had before he died, like Raphael, whom I had let die. A crash shattered the night. A door burst open under the force of rifle butts. Torches flared, throwing jagged shadows against the walls. The hunters.
He's already dead.
Isabeau hissed, but he wasn't. Not yet. Heavy footsteps echoed closer. In seconds they would see him. In seconds he would be nothing more than another body, another shadow in this endless night. My hand closed around his arm.
Don't do this.
Isabeau growled. Too late. I lifted him against me, his frail, feverish body pressed against my frozen chest. Without a word, I melted into the darkness. Isabeau followed. She could have stopped me. She could have cursed me for my weakness. But she said nothing. Perhaps she saw what I saw, a final fragment of humanity refusing to die. The rooftops swallowed us. Below, the hunters scoured the alley, searching for prey that had already vanished. When we were far from the carnage, I set the child down. Slowly, he opened his eyes. Fear and innocence gleamed there, but so did something else. A quiet resolve. I thought of Raphael, of his last words, of what I had let die with him. Isabeau watched me for a long moment before sighing, almost in resignation.
You just chose your side.
I said nothing, but I knew she was right. And that night, something within me changed forever.